Okay, now recording has started. Self-transcendence, which comes down to basically overcoming your own ego, not caring about yourself as much, caring about the larger, something larger than yourself, and feeling connected to something larger than yourself. And then there's a third group of definitions, which our own early models of wisdom have been part of, which basically looks more at wisdom in a developmental way, looking at how wisdom develops. And we argue that wisdom develops from life experience, but it also requires certain ways of thinking about and reflecting on life experiences. So as you can see, none of this is really contradictory. They all sort of fit together, but they are quite different in the emphasis they put on certain aspects of wisdom. So Monica Ardelt already wrote in 2005 that this reminds her a little bit of the old story of the blind man and the elephant, which I'm sure you know, where a group of blind men are trying to understand what an elephant is. And an elephant is very large, as we all know. So each of them can only touch part of the elephant. And as they are blind, they cannot see the elephant as a whole. So each of them will produce a definition of an elephant that kind of focuses on the part of the elephant that they are touching. And the elephant is the sum of all of it and more than the sum of all of it, right? So the elephant is more than any of these individual parts, and all of the parts are kind of interacting and functioning together collaboratively. And that's pretty much, I guess, what's happening in wisdom research. None of these definitions really contradict each other, but they focus on different aspects. And so since about 2020, people have started trying to integrate those different perspectives or different definitions into sort of more integrative models. And one of them is the model that Glück Weststrate and I have proposed in 2022. And that's sort of what I would like to focus on today a little bit. So what you've already maybe seen in the definitions that I showed you is that there are two broad groups or kinds of components or aspects of wisdom. And one aspect is the cognitive components, wise thinking, how wise people think about life. And the other group is what we call the non-cognitive components, because it's hard to find a good word that summarizes all of it. And that's more like the attitude that wise people have towards life and towards other people. So the cognitive components certainly include a lot of knowledge and a lot of experience. And it's not knowledge about, say, mathematics or chess. It's knowledge about life, knowledge about people, also about how people are different, and also knowledge about oneself. And the really fascinating part about the knowledge that wisdom involves is that it also involves knowledge about the limitations of knowledge. So wise people know a lot, but they also know how much they don't know, which is, as you all know, a very old idea. They know a lot about how different people have completely legitimately different perspectives on life based on different experiences and different backgrounds. They know a lot about how much in life you cannot know because things are unpredictable, things are uncontrollable, and so on. So the knowledge that wise people have includes a lot of knowing about non-knowledge. And then, of course, an important part of wise thinking is self-reflection. Wise people are constantly trying to question the way they think about something. They question their immediate intuitive reactions to some extent. They are aware of their own biases. They know that they might have blind spots in some fields, and they try to deal with that. And these cognitive components sort of go along nicely with the non-cognitive components of wisdom that we've identified across individual definitions of wisdom. And one of them is what we have called an exploratory orientation, which basically just means really wanting to understand life. You know, I've met people sometimes in my life who were going through really difficult times, really difficult conflicts or serious health challenges. And what some people have really seemed like they are, while they are going through something really difficult, they are kind of being sort of fascinated by watching it happening and watching and learning what it means, how it changes their life, kind of reflecting on what's happening and what it really means. And this is something that I've come to associate with wisdom a lot, this kind of desire to really understand life and the fascination with the complex issues about life. And that, of course, also goes along with a great deal of openness towards differences between people, towards different views, different perspectives, different ideas about life. The second, and some people say most important aspect, non-cognitive aspect of wisdom, is more of a motivational or moral aspect, and that's kind of basically caring about something larger than one's own or one's own group's needs, and caring about some kind of greater good, caring about the best possible solutions for the largest number of people, but also on the more individual level, experiencing compassion, experiencing caring concern about other people, not aiming basically to focus one's own, to emphasize mostly what one's own needs and wishes are. And the third component, which you usually find when you ask people if they know a wise person, is a certain kind of calmness, a certain kind of friendly detachedness. Wise people will hardly ever get really highly emotional, at least in terms of negative emotions. They will be able to remain calm even in situations where most of us really just like run around and want to yell or scream or whatever. Okay, so these components together make a pretty comprehensive picture, I think, of wisdom. And now what we have been doing, yeah, one important thing is maybe that they are clearly related, right? The exploratory orientation will probably lead people to gain a lot of life knowledge and life experience. Concern for others will lead people to understand the importance of looking at other people's perspectives and taking them seriously. Emotion regulation has a lot to do with self-reflection, right? I mean, looking at your own emotions, trying to understand them, learning how to regulate them if a situation requires it, is also something that's in reality, it's kind of in between, I guess, cognitive and non-cognitive aspects of wisdom. So all of this is kind of a whole that functions interactively and collaboratively. So what Nick and I have been doing in the model that we've been proposing is trying to understand why people so often don't act quite as wisely as you would expect them to be able to, right? So all of us, I guess, and this would be a question that I would like to ask you for just maybe 1 or 2 minutes. Think about your own life and think about when you did something that you would say was really very wise. And most of us, I think, have done some wise things in our lives. But then also think about other situations where you did something that really wasn't wise at all. And that has also happened, I guess, to most of us. We're going to talk more about these things later in the workshop. For now, I would just like you to think about this for yourself and then maybe focus on the question why you were able to be super wise in this one situation or maybe two situations in your life, and why on the other hand in other situations your wisdom related knowledge that you probably have completely failed you. So I would like to just give you a little bit of time to think about this and maybe remember what you've been thinking when we later go into the second part, which is the workshop that I'll be doing. Okay, I hope you've come up with something. And as I said, we'll come back to this later. The question really for the moment is why do we sometimes not act quite as wisely as we probably know we could? And so often we regret afterwards that we didn't do the thing that now seems pretty obvious as the wise thing to do. For me, I can say very clearly that it's often like being too emotional, getting too angry, especially, or too maybe sometimes too worried too quickly, and then not being able to think clearly. And that may be also one reason why I came up with this particular model that I'm going to show you in a moment. So basically what Nick Weststrate and I were doing is try to like put together components from different models of wisdom in trying to understand how they might actually cause some people to act wisely, even in highly challenging situations. And I'm going to walk you through this model now in a lot of small steps. So the first thing that we are starting from is a wisdom requiring situation. So one of the funny things about wisdom is that we don't really use it that much or need it that much in our everyday life. We mostly need it in those situations where it's harder than in other situations to actually utilize our wisdom. So what is a wisdom requiring situation? We've done some studies where we asked people about the situations they showed wisdom in, and it turns out situations that people talk about tend to be complicated, difficult, often involving several different viewpoints. They tend to have a certain amount of importance, so it's not about like deciding whether you should take the bus or the train today, but it's about really like life decisions, difficult challenges, conflicts, things like that. And they tend to have a certain level of emotional involvement that they bring with them. So it's usually situations where we really struggle to some extent. Those are the situations that most require wisdom. And now the question is, what happens to our state of mind, to our way of feeling in such situations? And as I already mentioned, some of us sometimes tend to get very emotionally aroused, be it whether it be very angry, very scared, very nervous, whatever. Um, and those kinds of high emotional involvement tend to also make us more narrow-minded, more focused on our own perspective, and less able to think really well and really clearly. Wise people, however, those people who we call wise, tend to not get into that unwisdom state of mind. They tend to be able to remain calm and caring and open-minded and ethical, even in situations where most of us really struggle with maintaining that kind of mindset. So the question is, how do they do that? Why are they able to maintain their calm even in those very challenging situations? And that's where, in our view, the non-cognitive components of wisdom come in. And we've identified three like broad groups of non-cognitive components that I've already sort of shown you. I would like to talk a little more about each of these components now, giving you little examples, example quotes from a study that we did where we interviewed wisdom nominees and other people about very difficult situations from their own lives. So the first one would be an exploratory orientation towards life. And this is from a woman who had a child who was born with a serious brain, some sort of brain damage. And they didn't expect the child to have this kind of brain damage before she was born. So this came as quite a shock. And at the time of the interview, that girl was, I think, 16 or 17 years old. And her mother was talking about this whole experience of having this baby and then bringing her up and living with her. And she basically, we also had participants list different kinds of events from their lives. And she listed this event both as the most difficult event, the birth of the child, and as the best event in her life, because she said she has learned so much and grown so much from this experience. And as you can read here, she says, "My daughter is my greatest teacher. I just see by going through life with her that I'm permanently in a process of learning, because I permanently have to reflect on what life really means or what's really important. I constantly get to relativize things by accompanying her and seeing how she lives. This experience has changed so much in me, in the family, in my relationships, and everything." And you can see, I mean, she could also just say, "It's terrible. We are so stressed out. Everything is different than in other families." But she really sees how interesting, how fascinating this is, how much she can really learn about life and about life in general. And in other parts of the interview, she did talk about how it's really challenging and sometimes really difficult, but also how much she values the experience of learning about life and of growing from what's happening. So there you can see the exploratory orientation at work. In a broader sense, what we mean by an exploratory orientation is really wanting to understand things, even if sometimes understanding what's going on, let's say in a conflict, might actually hurt your own ego, right? Because you would come to see yourself as, let's say, selfish or uncaring. Even such an insight would be really interesting to a person with a strong exploratory orientation and would, of course, teach them something about themselves as well as about life. So people with this orientation are, as I said, really curious about other perspectives, and especially if those are really different from their own, where many of us have our limitations, right? There are certain worldviews or values where we're really not interested why people hold them, but maybe we should be interested. And the third aspect of exploratory orientation is being really also interested in emotions, one's own and others, taking them seriously, even if they are unwanted or complicated emotions. And I'll come back to the emotion aspect later. The second aspect that I've already mentioned is what we've broadly labeled as concern for others. And this is from the interview with the oldest participant we had in that study. She was, I think, 92 or 93 at the time we interviewed her. And she was still living on her own in the mountains, somewhere really beautiful in the Austrian mountains with a great view of the valley. And at some other point, she talked about how grateful she is to just look out of the window and see the sunshine. But here she's talking about her children. And she said, I'm never going to demand anything from my children. They know I'm going to live on my own as long as I'm able to live on my own and think on my own. When that's not possible anymore, they can put me into a nursing home, even if I refuse, because I'm perhaps confused. Because I think the children need to think forward, not backward. They need to take care of their offspring as I took care of my offspring. And children don't have to be grateful. And that's the part that often makes people smile or laugh a little bit when I talk about this in talks. What should they be grateful for? Being alive? They didn't ask to be alive. We wanted them. We had the joy of having kids. For our kids, having parents wasn't always joyful. So that's really quite impressive, the way she can really take her children's perspective and really kind of put it over her own needs and her own perspective. So basically, concern for others, on the one hand, includes being able to empathize with other people, both in a cognitive way, by just being able to understand why different people would have different perspectives, different needs, different feelings in a situation, but also effectively being able to actually feel other people's feelings. Though that latter one is kind of, as I'm going to say later as well, is going to be a little, that there can be too much of that. You can have too much effective empathy with someone to clearly see the broader picture. And then you're just going to be super angry with the other person, but you might not be able to help them understand why they even are in a conflict or whatever the problem is. Then, of course, concern for others involves benevolence very broadly, really caring to do something good for others more than doing something good for yourself. And that will also go along with the broader idea of a greater good orientation, which we believe for really wise people goes beyond like their own group or their own country, even beyond humanity, to include like our world at large, including nature, animals, and so on. The third non-cognitive aspect is emotion regulation. As I already said, wise people are able to stay calm even when most of us are not. So this participant talked about how she has learned to regulate her strong emotions, which she tended to have, by simply kind of in her mind taking a step back. And she said, when you take a step back, you can look at the situation from the outside. That's always important, I think, though it can be quite hard when you're very emotionally involved. But I've found that something that helps me when I'm in very challenging life situations, I step outside and look at the situation from the outside. And I look at myself, what's my role? Can I rewrite my role in the play? Or do I have to play it the same way every time? So the idea is that wise people may have strong emotions, but they have strategies for kind of down regulating them as a situation requires, which definitely does not mean not perceiving them, not being aware of them, but being able to not necessarily, show them to everybody or make everybody suffer from one's own emotions. Okay, so the idea is people who have these three broad wisdom capacities are more likely to stay calm, caring, ethical, and open-minded, even in those really challenging situations. And our next idea is that only if you manage to be at least somewhat in this kind of mindset, you will be able to fully access your cognitive wisdom components. So you may have all this great wisdom-related knowledge in your brain, but if you're too angry, too worried, too self-focused to even think wisely, you're not going to use that knowledge. So basically, the mindset really determines whether people are going to be able to use their cognitive wisdom components in reasoning about the situation or the problem. So let's look at the cognitive components then. There are three of them again. Knowledge about life, knowledge about oneself, knowledge about other people is sort of included in knowledge about life. Metacognitive capacities, which basically comes down to knowledge about the limitations of knowledge, and then self-reflection. So self-knowledge is not always easy to obtain. This was a participant who was talking about the story of how she learned to even perceive her own emotions. And in the beginning, she was trying to hide many of her own emotions from others and especially from herself. So she says, since I was trying to hide so many weaknesses, hide them from others and from myself, I got into a major self-deception, a self-lie. I remember someone saying about someone else, that person is envious. Envy? Me? I've never been envious in my life. Or they said someone is angry. Angry? No idea. I don't even know what that is. So I sort of killed off many feelings in myself. But over time, I learned to look at my feelings, follow them, and learn from them. Learn about myself and learn about life. So she really gave us the buzzwords for using this quote. Um, Life knowledge, as I already said, includes a lot of things. So I could give you a ton of quotes about life knowledge, but what I find particularly interesting is how this knowledge usually involves knowledge about non-knowledge, right? So for example, this woman said, for all my life, I've learned that people are different, that you should never lecture or evangelize or try to convert anyone. That was very hard to learn. I've learned so many things about life, and every time I thought, now I know something, and now I'm going to share this knowledge. Everybody will be happy with it, right? And that never really happened, it seems. So life knowledge, as I said, directly includes the metacognitive capacities, the second component of the cognitive components, knowledge about the limitations of knowledge. And the third component would be self-reflection. This was a participant who talked about his child who so they got into a very serious conflict as that kid entered puberty, and the whole family was very, very upset. Everything was very complicated. But then they found a good way of sort of letting the child grow up and letting the child go. So basically, he was talking a lot about learning that being a father also meant to acknowledge that your child might be very different from you, from who you think they are. So he said, asked about what he had learned from the experience. He said, I've learned a ton of things about how people develop, about accepting that your child is not your property, but another human being, that your child is a complete independent human being in another generation. And that generation is different from me, different from my generation. I learned to actually listen to them. And I, being a mother of two like young adults myself, can also confirm that this is sometimes really hard to do because you have so much experience. You really think you know things. But not only will they not listen to you anyway, because they shouldn't be listening to their parents at all times at that age, but also their world is just so different that our experiences might really just not fit for the world that they are living in. And so it's really important, I think, to really learn to listen to them as we would listen to strangers. Many of us are better able to listen to strangers than to our own family members. That's something that this father also talked about in his interview. Right, so self-reflection would be about questioning one's own perspective and trying really to recognize where one is biased or where you have blind spots when it comes to seeing certain aspects of your children, for example, and how to try to overcome them. Okay, so the idea would be that people who have the wisdom mindset are then also able to use the extent of these cognitive components of wisdom that they have, and that would lead to wise reasoning. And then wise reasoning obviously would be expected to lead to wise behavior. And Bob Sternberg and other people, but especially Bob Sternberg, has often talked to me about how this link here between wise reasoning and wise behavior is certainly not a sure thing. Sometimes you know perfectly well what would be the wise thing to do, and you would be able to do it, but you still don't do it because of external constraints. But that's not the focus of this model, is my response usually. And the wise behavior that people engage in is usually going to lead to some kind of greater good. Okay, so that would be the model. Now the question is, to come back to what I asked you earlier, why don't we always do that? What are the main obstacles to wisdom? And I guess they are already kind of part of the model, but I think it makes sense to think about them in some more detail. So the exploratory orientation, the openness to different perspectives, what can be an obstacle to that? And I think one obstacle that we often see, that, for example, in university environments, I think you often see people who just have to be right. They are very sure that they are right, and they are not really interested in listening to other people's divergent perspectives, right? So, and a strong ego focus, a strong focus on being right is, I think, a major obstacle to wisdom. Another obstacle is, of course, being afraid of different perspectives or being contemptuous. And I think that's something that modern media tend to some extent foster a little bit. I've been very fascinated recently by the emotion of self-righteous anger, where you're really, really angry about something that, let's say, a political opponent has been doing or saying, and you're probably right to be angry, but the anger has this strong joyful component in it, right? It's really nice to be angry about someone and to be angry together with a lot of other people. And the unfortunate part is that this anger is not going to be very constructive, I think. It's not going to lead to some kind of dialogue and improvement. It's more going to lead to like bashing people on social media, and that's not probably not going to help. So that would be kind of obstacles to being open, being interested in different perspectives. When it comes to concern for others, a major obstacle obviously is the human tendency to think in groups and out groups, which closely relates to the point above. We tend to view people as either similar to us or not really important or very different. And that, I think, is a major reason for not really caring about people as much. The further they are away, the more they are different from you, or you think they are different from you. And then, of course, there's the whole aspect of just having selfish goals, or maybe like being in a position where you have to serve certain goals and other goals are just not allowed. That could also in some cases be something that's an obstacle to really caring about a greater good. And then, of course, emotion regulation, as we all know, kind of tends to break down when we are emotionally overloaded. And people seem to have quite different thresholds to where they get overloaded. And of course, having a strong focus on yourself and your own emotions can also make you unable to really care about the emotions of other people. In terms of the cognitive components, obviously the obstacle to having knowledge is not having knowledge. And this sounds very obvious, but it's sometimes really relevant when you're in situations where you're really lacking important knowledge. And then, of course, the first step to wisdom would be to ask a lot of questions and really try to understand the situation first, instead of just going with a kind of simplified interpretation of it. The metacognitive capacities have a lot of obstacles. One of them that I find very interesting is overconfidence. As soon as you're just too sure that you are right, you won't listen to people who have different perspectives. Control illusions are another interesting one, where we really believe we can control everything, and so we don't have to have any plans B or any other things. And then, of course, self-reflection can be really hard. Sometimes we just want something to be over, to be done with, right? We don't want to think in depth about what we did wrong in that conflict. We just want some closure. We want to say, okay, the other person was just not a good person, and I'm not going to think anymore about this. Or often, of course, we also have really deep self-reflection, might really sort of question our self-image in ways that would be really painful, and we just don't want to do that. So there's a ton of possible obstacles to wisdom, which might explain why there are few people in the world who act truly wisely, at least most of the time. But then, I guess in the world that we live in right now, that's a serious problem, right? We are faced with a number of crises simultaneously that really would need more wisdom, right? So the question is there anything we can do? And of course, there should be a lot we can do. We can try to become wiser ourselves by looking into our own wisdom obstacles and trying to get better at dealing with them. But that probably won't be sufficient for making the world a better place. We can also try to teach wisdom, and I'll say just a few words about that. Teach it to children, teach it in schools, teach it to students at universities, and so on. But I think the most important part might be to not just think about wisdom as this kind of stable personal trait, but also think about how systems and structures that we live and work in might affect the extent to which we even can act wisely in different situations. So let's take a quick look maybe at teaching wisdom, because this is something that Bob Sternberg has been writing about for like the last 10, 20 years a lot. And his main argument is basically the Flynn effect, for example, shows that people have grown more intelligent over the course of the whole 20th century by quite a large margin. So we're a lot more intelligent than the average person used to be 100 years ago. So you would think that would have done something good to the world. And if you look at the world now, it really makes you wonder about the value of intelligence. Similar things can be said about creativity. And Bob says that educational institutions such as schools, universities, and so on have really focused on teaching knowledge and teaching intelligence. And now, if you think about where we get our knowledge from, basically we have those little devices that contain more knowledge that we will ever be able to have in our our brains. The question is really more about where can we find reliable knowledge, right? And intelligence is certainly still an important thing, but in many domains of intelligence, computers are also going to soon be smarter than we are. So schools or other educational institutions, Bob says, should focus more on teaching wisdom. Now, of course, the question becomes how can that be done? And I'm happy to say a little more about it later on. I'm not sure school systems are really very much on that track yet, and I'm not quite sure how we could change them, but that could be a valuable endeavor, I think. And the other example, okay, I have one more slide about this. How can we teach wisdom? There's been a lot of research on like short-term interventions for teaching wisdom, for making people wiser just by activating wisdom resources, wisdom capacities that they have in their head anyway. So one study has shown if you're faced with a problem, you can respond more wisely to the problem if you just imagine talking about the problem to someone else you know well. Or you could just imagine imagine the problem not concerning you, but concerning someone else. Often that's already sufficient, right? I have a problem and I don't know what to do. And then I imagine what I would tell my friend if she had the problem. And then I'm like, oh, okay, well, it's actually not that hard. Or Igor Grossman and colleagues have shown in several studies that even just thinking or writing a diary in third-person language instead of first-person language might actually help you think more wisely because you're taking a less self-centered perspective. But these are like short-term interventions that just activate ways of thinking that you already have in your brain. On the other hand, of course, we could try to really teach wisdom on the trait level. And there's not that much research in that direction. Monica Adelt has done an important study there. And the research that exists seems to suggest, at least to me, that theoretical instruction, like reading philosophical texts or just basically reading books in general, does not seem to be quite sufficient. What people really need is to draw a lot of relationships to their own life, to their own experiences, for this to really foster wisdom. And then what we see a lot actually is that what might be the most effective way of teaching wisdom is to having wisdom models, like having teachers who actually live wisdom in students' real lives. But there's not too many of those, I guess. Okay, so the other question is really about not just teaching wisdom, but kind of changing structures to foster wisdom. There's, for example, a book by James Surowiecki that's almost 20 years old now, and it's more about intelligence than about wisdom, really. But it basically says that if you ask a group of people for a solution to some kind of complex problem, the group can be smarter in the solution they produce than the smartest member of the group, but they aren't necessarily smarter. They might even actually be less smart than the smartest individual member of the group. And they will only be smarter if the group is heterogeneous. People have different kinds of knowledge that they bring together to produce something that's greater than any single person will produce. But also they have to value that heterogeneity and those differences. They have to listen to every voice if they want to create a solution that actually incorporates every voice, which makes a lot of sense theoretically, but is not always easy to do. Now, when you look at, for example, politics, where we would really love to have wise politicians, and we would really love to have wise solutions created for the difficult problems, let's say climate change or whatever we are faced with at the moment. But then when you think about what the system sort of asks a politician to do, given the media situation that we have, given all kinds of restraints and structures that they have, of course, politicians will have to think in like intervals between elections. They will nowadays have to make their political adversaries look bad. So a politician who says, well, actually, she's right about that. Let's maybe think about that, might not make the impression of really being this strong person that voters seem to really want to elect. They need to, of course, politicians depend, especially, let's say, in the United States, but in many other countries as well, they depend a lot on influential stakeholders who will then determine politics to some extent. They are obviously highly dependent on the media. And so there are some aspects of wise solutions that they are just unlikely to pursue for reasons that are not in them not being wise people, even though some politicians might not be particularly wise. But the point really is to what extent structures and systems, not just in politics, but in any field basically that you want to think about, kind of impede wisdom, even if individuals could be wiser than they actually end up acting. Okay, thank you very much. That's kind of maybe a good point to listen to your questions or your discussion points.
Thank you very much. So if you'd like to ask a question, you can put up your virtual hand by clicking on the reactions tab and then going to raise hand. Or if you'd prefer to write your question in the chat, you're welcome to do so. Judith, I'll start off the questions. So, or a comment for your comment. I think that in the obstacles to wise behavior, you mentioned the issue of emotion regulation, where there are issues of if someone has strong negative emotions, it doesn't regulate them well. But I would like to suggest that perhaps arguably an even more, a bigger issue in terms of wisdom regulation is, or wisdom obstacles, is regulation of biological drives. Which, when we refer to the sex drive, for example, Freud would call it the libido. That's not an emotion in most definitions of emotions. It has a strong felt quality, but it has and obviously relates to to certain brain systems, etc. But it's distinct, and yet it's when we hear of examples of people who behaved in ways that are unwise, it's more often than not because they've followed their libido rather than those cluster of wise cognitions that you described. So I wanted to get your thoughts on that.
No, I absolutely agree with that. Yeah, I guess maybe emotion, maybe self-regulation, that would be too broad because it would bring in all kinds of other issues as well. But I very much agree that it's not just emotions in the sense of just being momentarily emotionally like angry or whatever. Absolutely, libido can certainly, and we've seen a lot of those situations as well, like with famous people and so on, where these aspects, I mean, I think one general aspect that kind of creates some kind of tension nowadays is that people tend to be very, and that's a good thing, I think, that people tend to be very attentive to like their own needs, their own desires, their own emotions more than maybe people used to be. But then they kind of also feel sort of entitled to follow up on those, right? And there's some kind of interesting tension there where I mean, it's like the oldest, I guess, the oldest issue in humanity generally, where your own needs kind of get against someone else's needs, and where the borders are of what to what extent you can fulfill your own desires and needs, right? But that's still something I think that's often unresolved in real life.
Indeed, yeah, it's a conundrum, and the conundrum is and this is something that's been discussed for arguably centuries, is to what extent do you aim to overcome those urges, or to what extent do you squeeze them out in different directions? I mean, that's Freud, of course, referred to sublimation as this way of kind of sort of giving the libido some sort of outlet, but without necessarily doing things that relate to its traditional purpose. Right, let's have a look in the chat. Jose says, my questions are cognitive obstacles. Every fact you said seems to me precise, important one. I wonder why not consider epistemic views on problems that may affect the way they are faced and solved. So I mean, that's sort of a big thing potentially. But what are your thoughts on that, Judith? Kind of the obstacle is in the way of the episteme that kind of frames the problem.
Yes, I absolutely think, I mean, I think we know way too little about how wisdom actually deals with problems, right? So we always talk about these things, like it's important to consider different perspectives. Bob Sternberg, for example, says it's important to like balance different perspectives, which is certainly true. But how do you do it, right? And I think the whole idea of how you even frame a problem, how you then go about defining what's the important goal, even defining, for example, what the greater good is, right? We talk about a wise solution will always maximize a greater good. Okay, but then when you think about real life problems, people will differ on in what they think the greater good is, right? So it's going to be hard to even agree on that. And so I think the whole idea of also the idea of having epistemic humility on the one hand, but on the other hand, also finding ways to really define, okay, how do we even go about this, right? How do we structure the problem? Then also on how about as we solve the problem, how do we evaluate where we are? When do we decide to step back and to change something? I think that's something where we weirdly know very little. Decision making is a large field in psychology and in other fields, and we've recently been trying to look into decision making to get a better idea of how wise problem solving might happen, right? But we're still only just starting to work on that. So I think yes, that's very important, and it goes way beyond psychology, I think.
Thanks. Yeah, so a comment from Mark, which is that he says a study shows that people versed in statistics tend to make better decisions in complex and uncertain situations.
I think one aspect in statistics is that even being aware of probabilities, and Gigerenzer has really shown this very impressively, being aware of the small probability of the things that actually scare us a lot, for example, is something that's really super helpful in maintaining a wise mindset, right? I mean, often, people read about this terrible thing in the news, and then they're like, oh my God, we have to kick out all the asylum seekers or whatever, right? And then being aware of probabilities of numbers in a way that really goes beyond just being completely driven by single cases is, I think, very important, and that would help a lot. That's something where Gigerenzer has also looked into how this could be taught. Yes.
Yorgos, who's from Greece, says something which relates to the challenge of trying to do this work across different languages, which he says, I wonder in what ways wise is different from smart. In Greek, I think we say more often that's not a smart thing to do instead of that's not a wise thing to do. But there obviously, you must, Judith, you worked across many different, with the partners from many different countries, you must find this, there are subtle differences in the way these things are defined.
I think there's one really interesting general aspect is whether wisdom even means the same thing in different languages. And I'm not sure even the German and the English word wisdom really mean exactly the same thing. And it might be yet different, very different in Greece, where we certainly have different ideas about, like ancient Greek even had those different forms of wisdom. I mean, our general answer to this question is that a smart thing to do might not include a focus on some greater good or some moral considerations or things like that. It might just be smart in terms of optimizing your own benefit or something, right? So that's one I guess basic definition. We've shown in a paper that intelligence, certain forms of intelligence, are one component of wisdom. So they are sort of a certain level of intelligence is necessary, but not sufficient for wisdom. How do we know what is a wise way to study wisdom? Yeah, I sure wonder about that a lot. And we've been trying to actually deal with this a little bit. We've written one paper where we looked at whether people who do not share the typical values that university people share still have similar views of wisdom. So for example, we looked into whether left-wing and right-wing people whether, let's say, Trump voters, I mean, to put it simply, whether Trump voters would really think Trump is very wise, or whether they wouldn't really consider him as wise, but still vote for him for other reasons. And what we did find is that there actually, this is still just about what people think wisdom is, and not necessarily about what wisdom really is. But we do seem to find some middle ground, like even strongly right-wing people who tend to be very in-group focused say that a wise person would be less in-group focused. At the same time, very left-wing people who tend to be very non-traditional would say that a wise person would be somewhat more traditional than they are. So people seem to at least agree on something that goes beyond what I personally believe what wisdom is. Still, I think I know quite a few wisdom researchers quite well, and I think to some extent you can see their personalities or their priorities reflected in their models, and that's something that has been sometimes worrying me, and sometimes I've been sort of enjoying it too.
Thank you so much, Judith. I expect a number of these themes will come back in the workshop. So in terms of timing, we're basically 10 minutes behind, but that's fine. So what I suggest now is that we'll have a 10-minute break, and then we'll restart at 5 minutes past. So in whatever hour you are, or collective audience from China all the way to Massachusetts. So, but yeah, so 5 minutes from now, excuse me, 10 minutes from now, and we'll be back and starting the workshop. Does that sound okay? Great. All right. We'll see you in 10 minutes. I'm going to go and get a cup of tea.
The idea for this now would be to basically take you to a little bit of personal reflecting on when you maybe weren't that wise, as we already did a little bit in the beginning, and then think about what could be learned from that. But I would like to start taking a little step back. Basically, what I would like you to do is generally get into menti.com, which is the software that I use to do little surveys while I'm giving talks. So either, depending on what device you want to use, it works quite nicely with a smartphone, actually. So if you're watching on a computer, you could just take your smartphone and scan this QR code.
Already
or
done.
You can go to menti.com and enter this code here, which is
That's what it looks like when it works.
6877941. Hope it works. And then I'll have to switch. I'm going to give you a moment and I'll have to get this thing probably started. Okay, so I will see if anybody does it. Does it do anything?
Yep.
Good, great. So then this is just a little scale. The point really is, first of all, to think about, and this is basically the wisdom components that I've showed you earlier. So the question is to think about yourself in conflicts and to what extent you think you do all the things that are listed on this scale. So I will try to figure out how to show that screen. I can actually try to show that screen right away because it says it gives the number and everything on there as well. Oh yeah, that should work actually. So can you see the code still, but the different? No, that's not okay. Dang. I would like to show. Sorry, I have done this before, but it's been a while. Okay, what I would like to show is another Chrome tab. Yes, that's the one. The Mentimeter Chrome tab. Yes, there we go. And now I can see, yeah, people are already filling it out. And at some point I can then show the collective responses. Okay, we're at something like 27 people having filled it out. So maybe I'll wait until like, let's say 30 or something. Never know really how many people are participating.
We've got 29 people who've done it so far, 30
so
now.
30. So maybe I'm just gonna see if this works. Okay, so you are a pretty wise group, which makes obvious sense. So
Well,
yeah,
we think we're wise anyway.
we think we are wise, exactly, and that's pretty much the point of this. But okay, it's interesting to see that, yeah, the remaining calm and even tempered doesn't seem to be just my problem. Okay, that just reminds me that I was going to start this part of this workshop with a little story. So I'm still going to tell you the story now. Me and my family, we go on a little trip every year, like to some kind of city, because my kids especially love cities. So like usually we go to London of all places, and we'll be there 10 days from now. And I'm hoping to see you there, Oliver. But a few years ago, because of COVID, we went to Berlin instead. And then we had this little situation where we had to go to the airport, and one of my kids had to go somewhere else before, so we were kind of late. And then there was this question of whether we need COVID tests, and nobody really knew. And then at some point we got to the airport and we were late and there was a terribly long line and it was still unclear whether we needed COVID tests. And at that point I freaked out completely and I yelled at my husband how in ways that I haven't since, and I hadn't for a long time before. And the funny thing was that at the back of my mind I was thinking, okay, I'm a wisdom researcher and whenever I give talks people will ask me, so do you become wise from being a wisdom researcher? And I always say, well, kind of theoretically, at least you do learn a lot of things, but it's really hard to realize them in practice. And now there we were, and it really wasn't a big thing. It was just this airport, and we might miss our flight and then get another flight. So it really wasn't a terrible catastrophe. And I was completely like yelling and freaking out. And so that's what taught me once again about the difference between, what we think we would like to be and who we really are. So that's something that this is also about a little bit, because the next part of this questionnaire actually asks you, okay, I'm not sure if I can, how I can now move to the next slide. Yes, I can. Now I would like to ask you just to basically think quickly, maybe for a minute or so, about the serious conflict, relatively serious conflict you had, like let's say in the past year, maybe a little earlier, whatever, something that was really quite difficult for you. And we're not going to obviously look into data on this very much, but the issue would really be for you to try to put yourself back into that situation for maybe just a minute. Really think about, okay, how close was I to the other person? How emotionally involved was I? To what extent did that situation preoccupy you beyond what was actually happening? Just think about this difficult conflict for a moment, and I guess you can maybe see where this is heading, because in the next page is going to ask you to what extent you did the things that you just said you do a lot during that particular specific conflict, right? So this is now not about us in general and how wise we think we are, but how wise we really were during one specific wisdom requiring situation. So this is just basically to make you think about the conflict a little bit and put yourself back into the situation for a moment. Okay, maybe let's move on from here. Let's just see. The response is great. So we're looking at relatively serious conflicts with people you are close to and you were emotionally involved and preoccupied. So this is serious conflicts. Now let's see. Okay, let's see what you actually did during those conflicts. And yeah, please be honest, because this is really just collective. It's not about, I cannot see any person's data specifically. Okay, if you hear some knocking, that's just my dog wagging. Sorry about that. Stop that, come on. Okay, something just happened. I got kicked out of my own Mentimeter. That is strange. Can you still see the survey?
No, I can see
No, I can see
the
that. So
University Klagenfurt.
which is good, but okay, let me just try to get, I don't know what happened right now, but okay. I'll try to get back into it. My presentations, the ongoing one, whatever happened. Yeah, new results, that's where I want to go. Present. Yeah, they moved some things around. Great, nice of them to tell me. Okay, so it's weirdly blinking now, and here we are. So I'm going to, can you see the first slide again now?
Yes.
Great. Okay, so then let's go to the one that we're actually working on. Yes. Okay, thank you so much for kind of proving my point. The nice thing about Mentimeter is that you can now see sort of the distribution of the responses. So basically, we can see that a lot of people, some people still, for example, try to balance everyone's needs, but many others sort of were a little lower than they were before. Especially the remaining calm and even tempered thing tends to always create a little hill up here on the lower side. People still usually try to understand the situation, but even the putting oneself into the shoes of everyone kind of tends to be a little harder in concrete, difficult conflicts, right? So that's basically just the point that I wanted to make earlier as well about how we really, when we really need our wisdom, which I'm sure you really have, so it's not like you were lying to yourself in the earlier slide, but the thing is just how it sort of tends to break down when we most need it. Also, that taking everyone's viewpoint into account, which we really try to do at all times, but sometimes when we're really involved, it gets really just hard to do that. So it's always nice to kind of question oneself. And I think it also tells us something interesting, by the way, about how to measure wisdom, because many scales just you do this thing where you ask people about what they do in general, and then it will look like the first one we saw about conflicts in general. But then there's other approaches that actually look at what people did in specific situations, and then it's sometimes the divergence is actually quite interesting. Okay, so thank you for participating in this. The next, so I thought it might actually be a nice idea to just do this as a kind of interactive presentation thing. So the next thing would just really be to come back to what I asked you at the beginning of my talk earlier, to think about situations, maybe more than just one, maybe two or three, where you did something that you consider as really, let's say, quite wise as you want, but relatively wise, and then things that you did that really clearly weren't wise, but then specifically to think about the difference. Why did you sometimes do the wise thing and at other times not? And then the idea would really be, let's see if this works. So this is an open response thing where you get to write single words mostly, to really put the reasons why you were able to act wisely in the wisdom situations. And then the next slide, the next word cloud is going to be why you were not able to act wisely in the non-wisdom situations. So the idea would be for you to just enter one, two, or three things that helped you act wisely in one situation or two, and then didn't help you act wisely, but made you act unwisely in the next slide. So, okay, responses are hidden. Let's just see what people say. Okay, let's see. I think not much is happening anymore. So let's maybe just see what people have said. Okay, this needs. The thing is, when you have word clouds and people write longer things, then of course a word cloud, basically a larger word, is one that more than one person has written, and sometimes there's just a few words that will come out as really big because everybody puts them, and here it's more like lots of different things, which is also, I think, quite interesting. So the one thing that more than one person, I guess, has put is knowledge, able to make a step back. I can rethink in others' shoes, high self-efficacy in control of emotions, concern for others, focused on the issue. So I hope you can read them as well as I can read them, because I think together they really make a great picture. And they also show, I think, in some cases that sometimes which I'm going to show you a slide on later, that I believe that sometimes there are some aspects of wisdom where you can have too much or too little, and sort of the middle ground is the best. Okay, so I think together this makes a really nice picture of ways people can be wise. So let's look maybe at the next question, which maybe produces the the more negative things. Why were you not wise? Why weren't you able to act wisely in the situations where you did something that was really, truly unwise?
Judith, you're muted.
Oh, great. I've been talking for 2 minutes. Thank you so much for telling me. Sorry. I've been going through all those interesting...
It was actually, you were down low on your camera, so I missed it. But sorry, if you can rewind to the beginning.
I'm trying to read the words because it's really kind of small on my screen, so sorry about that. Okay, I started by saying that I really like it that tired is the largest one, because that's very much how I feel at the end of a semester right now. And then there's this big group of like emotional, different ways of saying I was too emotional. There's an interesting little, I think, cluster of people saying like I was hurt, I was feeling betrayed, things like that kind of make us, feeling betrayed, feeling hurt by someone else, I think is making it very hard to see some other perspectives. Hungry, I also like that a lot. Overconfidence is also coming up with, which I think is a really interesting one. Taking it too seriously is also something that looks familiar to me. Okay, so I think this also makes a really good and interesting picture of things, of traps that we can fall into. Right-wrong dichotomy is also one I like very much. I think one thing that I've been thinking about a lot is that there's things that I think might be just some kind of wired into human cognition, the way we need to look at things, the way we like dichotomies, like if this is not right, it has to be wrong, or the way we like to think linearly. If something is good, then more of it has to be even better. And I think that's something that's very interesting when it comes to wisdom, that often like the wisest range is sort of in the middle. And I think I have a slide on that somewhere. So thank you very much for participating in this. I love Mentimeter and I use it in my lectures a lot, because I think it's really nice to engage with the audience in this way. Somebody asked if it exists in other languages. Yes, it does. There's a German version that I use for my teaching in German. And I mean, basically, even if it speaks English to you,
it's from Denmark, actually. It was developed by Danish people, isn't it? So there are various language versions. I also happen to use Mentimeter. We have a university subscription, and I think it's absolutely fantastic.
Absolutely. My university, unfortunately, refuses because it's sort of expensive, but there's other ones as well that are similar. So I think it's super helpful for doing these kinds of things and also for teaching. So big recommendation. But maybe now I'll still go back to the slides that I had, because I wanted to just, discuss some more things. So I'm going to start to present this, and then switch the screen sharing to the other screen. Sorry, I'm not that used to Zoom, but I'm practicing. Okay, so this is what we just did. I wanted to just come back to the model I showed you earlier just for 1 second, because I do think, I was hoping, and I do think that the reasons you talked about or wrote about for why you were able or not able to act wisely do fit nicely with the kind of 3 components that we have here, especially the emotion component. And I'm really, really interested in looking more also into the literature on emotion regulation and on practical strategies for dealing with this kind of getting too emotional about things. But what I really wanted to also discuss is the question of the medium level of wisdom resources, because I think in some cases we've also seen this here. Having empathy is certainly good for wisdom, but having too much empathy might actually blind you to some other aspects of the situation, right? If you are completely, I mean, I've had this happening sometimes, that when I have two colleagues who tend to have conflicts, and I like both of them. So when I'm talking to each of them, I completely understand their side and I completely understand their feelings, and I'll really be feeling their feelings. And then I go to the other side and then I feel the other person's feelings. And then I'm like, okay, so how am I supposed to help anyone in this conflict if I just completely understand both of them, right? So the question is really sometimes, is there too much empathy? Is empathy really a good thing? Isn't it sometimes good to really have some kind of middle ground? And the same, and a frequent thing is that you have people who have those really big egos and they never ever self-reflect. And on the other hand, you have people who self-reflect constantly and who totally have no ego whatsoever and who basically think anything they do is too little, too bad. We're talking a lot of imposter syndrome these days in science. So I think there can be a too little of self-reflection, and there can also be a too much, where it just becomes plain self-criticism with no kind of self-compassion or anything behind it. You can be too unopen to really be listening to different perspectives, or you can really also be too susceptible to basically taking on anyone's perspective if you don't really have clarity about what you really feel or what you really stand for. Obviously, there's this big issue of overconfidence, but there's also this issue of underconfidence, right? Sometimes you can be really good at something, but never know that you're really good at it. I often have students who, before the final exam, they completely panic, and I know that they will be excellent, and then they are excellent, and then they walk out and we decide that of course they get the best grade because they were excellent, and then we let them come in again and tell them they're great, and they're like, oh my god, I thought I failed. And then it really makes you wonder about their image of themselves. And then of course there's this big issue that I find super interesting of having too many control illusions, really thinking you can control everything, but then also having no control beliefs at all, and basically feeling that you're helpless about everything that happens in your lives. And both is equally not wise, right? So basically what this comes to is the kind of old serenity prayer that people tend to like so much that they even kind of tattoo it on their hairy legs, which basically says, God grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can. And now that's the main point, the wisdom to know which is which, right? And that basically means that as people starting from Aristotle have been saying, wisdom is really the kind of meta virtue that basically tells you what is right in which situation, right? Sometimes it's important to have empathy. Sometimes we tend to have too little empathy, especially with people who are far away or who are very different. And sometimes we have too much empathy, right? And knowing which is which and what we need to turn on or turn off sort of among our wisdom resources, I think is really the challenge. And so one thing I wanted to show you is that this did not make it into our big wisdom paper, but I think it's still interesting. I hope you can read it. Basically, the idea is that different wisdom problems require different wisdom components to a larger or smaller extent. So basically, one kind of dimension along which you can arrange wisdom problems is personal involvement. So you may be very personally involved in a problem, like deciding about caregiving for your own father who has Alzheimer's, or you may be talking to the stranger on the train who talks about their father having Alzheimer's. And the problem is just the same, but you may need very different emotional resources. In the one situation, you really need to kind of regulate your feelings of guilt or whatever, or maybe upregulate your feelings of guilt depending on what the situation is. And then when you're talking to that stranger, you basically need to really try to be empathetic and to consider the stranger's feelings, which you might not do automatically, right? And the other kind of dimension, which is sometimes related to the first one, is the scope of the problem, right? You can have this individual problem in your own family, or this individual stranger on the train, or you can have problems that are more interpersonal, like relating to like work teams or things like that. And they again can be high in personal involvement or low in personal involvement. And then it goes up all the way to being to being a lawmaker who develops a new law that, I don't know, deals with some prior injustice. And this again might be very personally involving if this is something that's really about your own life or your own life story, or it may be something that you don't care about at all, really, where it's really important to get your empathy up, right? And to get your caring about the problem up. So I think wisdom involves all those different components, but one important aspect of wisdom is knowing when to use which of them to which extent. Right, and I think basically there wasn't that much more that I really wanted to tell you. I mean, I wanted to discuss one more aspect, and that's professional wisdom. This is something that we've been studying in several different projects. There are some professions where we would really like people to be wise. I've always wanted to have wise teachers for my children. Now my daughter seems to have one, which makes me very happy. We all would like to have wise doctors, I suppose, especially when it comes to important and difficult health decisions. We would like to have wise judges. We would like to have very much wise politicians, and we very much don't get them much of the time. So basically, there are different obstacles in those different professions. And as I said, many of those obstacles are not like on the personal level, but on the systemic level. So there are reasons why teachers, even if they might be very wise as a person, might not be able to kind of live out their wisdom in their professional activity, because they are supposed to teach kids math, and there's some kind of standardized testing at the end of the year. So they don't have a chance to take up some kind of conflict that's happening in the class, because they have to deal with, I don't know, whatever, some kind of complex mathematical issue. Or doctors who are basically being paid by the hour, right? So or not by the hour, but by the number of patients they see per hour. So they just don't have the time to listen to individual patients. And so on. So I basically think this is just something I would like to, looking at the time, I would maybe just like to discuss a little bit. Maybe people would like to write something in the chat about this. I don't know how much time we actually want to spend on this. Maybe it's also just something for you to take home and think about. What wisdom means in different professions. I can also say a little more about the professions that we've looked at, and what constraints basically operate on people's wisdom in those professions. And by that,
Thanks. Well, we've got about 10 minutes, I would say, or maybe a little bit more if needed, 10 to 15 if we need it.
So, but then maybe that would be a good time to just start having a bit of a discussion about this, right? About what we've had, and maybe also about this issue.
I have a thought, and I wonder if this has come up in your wisdom classes before, and that relates to societal obstacles to wisdom. And so a thought came to me that firstly, I completely agree with you that it's in the middle ground that wisdom often manifests rather than at the extremes. As Erickson said, Erik Erikson was big on this as well, as if you take any virtue and push it to the extreme, it becomes problematic. Yes. So that there's this kind of the balancing of the dystonic and the syntonic, and that kind of healthy space where you don't have too much or too little. But there's no doubt about it that in Western culture these days, children and adults are told that the more that they take a virtue or some apparent good, whether that's money or happiness, and the best thing to do is to push it to the extremes. Have as much as you possibly can, and that seems to be kind of reiterated across in so many different ways. And I'm going to suggest that perhaps that's even more so in America. And Claire, you can let me know your thoughts whether that's the case. It seems to be a culture where extremes and the kind of polarities seem to have become worshipped to some degree. But Judith, do you ever discuss this in your classes? Does it come up at all, this issue of kind of contemporary issue with imbalance?
I very, very much agree with what you said. And it's somehow also, I think it has to do with the individualist culture that many of us live in these days. And America is always the classical example, but I guess it's not just about the US. And I think I've recently been talking to someone about how it even comes down to the way we do statistics. Like we look at correlations most of the time when we want to see whether two things are related. And basically a correlation just means more of one thing is more of the other thing. So more whatever means more happiness, for example, right?
Yeah,
whereas in reality, the happiness might be in the middle, and you wouldn't even see that if you don't look at plots, right?
I've also thought that. So all of our statistics in psychology, bar a few, are based on the linear model. So you're looking for more of everything. You're looking for linear relationships rather than curvilinear relationships, which is often a health-based relationship. For example, you don't want too much blood sugar or too little. You want that curvilinear spot. You want the middle ground.
And I do think that's true for many of the things we want in our lives, that we don't want them at the expense of other things, and we don't need or don't maybe don't even want too much of them, right? Yeah. And I think that's definitely something. And I do think there's some kind of natural tendency in humans to want more of something that's good, that maybe some evolutionary based whatever,
definitely.
Right? It probably makes some sense, right? But it doesn't make sense.
You see this in rats as well. If you give them food that contains sugar and fat, they just keep eating because it's so Moorish, literally. But Claire, as a multicultural Brit in America, what's your take on that?
I think I agree with both what you said. I do think it's the individualism here and I feel bad too speaking as an English person living in the US, because I know there are people from the US here as well who may disagree with me, but kind of coming from the UK, and my dad is from India too. So I've got this whole, like, all these cultures that I've been exposed to. And I think coming here, I definitely see more individualism. And of course, there's more. One of my friends from the UK, he came, I was here for university as well, and he came to visit me. And I remember him coming home with a bag of popcorn that he said was 2 times the size of his head. And he couldn't believe that such a product existed, right? And really, you probably need this much, but you have this. And when you were talking about the rats too, Ollie, I was thinking that's very similar to humans as well. And especially in this culture where sugar, fat is everywhere, and it's, constantly being promoted, and it's delicious. We all know it's delicious, and it's all I want to eat all the time. And trying to restrain myself, I think, is very hard, especially where it's on offer.
For me personally, I think individual and collectivism is another of those balancing acts, and both are problematic if taken to the extremes. In highly collectivist cultures, you have issues with questioning authority and questioning tradition and and standing apart, which can be problematic. But same again. When you take any polarity and you find unhealthiness at extremes, I think.
I once heard a really interesting talk from a colleague who's doing crisis intervention psychology, and so she went to the countries where the tsunami happened in 2004, right? And she said that she was seeing post-traumatic growth after that tsunami there, because she did some kind of long-term study there then. And she said that her impression was that in some very collectivist societies, post-traumatic growth meant individualizing to some extent. So people meant in the typical countries where we study post-traumatic growth, like individualist countries, it's often associated with becoming closer to other people, right? Feeling more connected to other people. And then she found that actually in those countries where you feel very connected, it might actually mean becoming more aware of your own needs and priorities. I always wanted to follow up on that in a study, which I never did, but I found it very fascinating.
I've done some research that points to that as well. We've got a hand up from Bella. Bella, would you like to turn your mic and camera on?
Yeah, I just wanted to present my appreciation, especially for those of you who are coming from American culture, Claire, Oliver, Judith, and you have this courage to call out the inadequacies in the culture. I think I have huge respect for all of you to be able to call out. And it's just that unless and until we identify the inadequacies, we'll not be able to offer any change or any resolution for that matter. So my appreciation, thank you very much for that.
And where are you from?
I'm from Pakistan.
You're from Pakistan, right? Yeah. Well, as we say, there's that some of the inadequacies can be because cultures tend to sometimes to take a stance which can be imbalanced, and being wise is often exploring the opposites.
And Oliver, I would just completely agree when you say that too much of either extreme is problematic. So individualism is a problem in the US, collectivism is a problem in this side of the world, right? So too much of anything is problematic.
Right. So if you'd like to ask a question or make a comment, put your hand up. I'm just going to look in the chat now to see if there's anything there. Various bits and bobs that relate to the previous points. Bjorn says contemplative practices and peace education. That's a topic for me as an educator. And Katja mentions yoga. So I don't mind saying that personally. So that I found that mindfulness practice has helped me to cultivate wisdom. And but I'll tell you something else that's been very helpful for me as well, is that learning how to use I statements in challenging interpersonal contexts. So because I'm head of department in psychology at Greenwich, I oversee 70 staff and 1,300 students, and it's just it's as any of you in leadership positions will know, it's you have to really hold your space and make sure that you stay calm. And I find that I use it every day in emails, and spoken communication is that when I'm saying what I think, I preface it by saying that it's my perspective, rather than putting it out there as a fact. And it allows for a range of other views to be then stated, which allows for those views to be sort of accepted, and then you can put together a resolution. And we teach it to our students as well, how to use I statements effectively. I will try that. There's a link to a recent study showing how the use of I statements can improve a variety of positive outcomes. I'll try and find the link and put it in the chat at some point. Judith, you're nodding to that.
I'm nodding to both.
Again, does this relate to sort of your experiences and your teachings?
Yeah, I can totally relate to what you say about students. I also wanted to agree to the mindfulness meditation. I think all kinds of like meditation, yoga, mindfulness practices can just help with that kind of step back emotional involvement thing. I think it's interesting about how we deal with like students, for example. I have a lot of experience in that area as well, and a lot of challenging experience. I find another thing that I found really helpful, because sometimes, you know, many of you may have also had the experience that some students are really just difficult, you know, and they really challenge you, and it's really hard to remain friendly and calm and everything. One thing that's been helping me, at least since I've had relatively grown-up kids, is something that a colleague taught me. And she said, you know, when somebody's being really difficult, I try to imagine that they have parents too, and that their parents are worried about them. And so I can imagine that person like me basically thinking, oh my God, today he's got this meeting with his professor, and I hope he's not going to be like that again. And so I can sort of relate to the mother, and then then develop some kind of secondary, slightly motherly feeling toward the child, and that then will help me get my empathy up a little bit. But at the same time, I think it's super important to kind of use I statements and things like that to also kind of position oneself, right? So I think this is also a balance thing, right? To treat them, kind of make your own position clear, but also kind of be able to relate them to some extent. I think that's a super interesting challenge that I guess we all face in professional relationships with people we might not want to have like personal relationships with.
Thanks.
Okay.
Prathan said, how do you see the concept of common good in wisdom in this current discussion of individualistic and collectivist concern? Any thoughts on that?
Well, I certainly would say that the common good idea is something that tends to get lost a little bit sometimes in very individualistic, like worldviews that we sometimes convey to our kids, also in terms of parenting and things like that. Parenting nowadays in let's say in the very Western countries, I think focuses a lot on teaching kids to know what they want and to live up to their standards. At the same time, I think it's too simple to say basically individualistic people don't care about the common good. I also see young people nowadays very much caring about the common good, be it climate change or be it really just like politically caring about minorities and things like that. So I think I wouldn't say that individualistic cultures are basically not caring about the common good. The question is probably very much how you define it and to what extent it's something that you have as a personal goal as opposed to a kind of societal goal. So I do think that's I would have to think more about this
Thanks.
issue.
I just found the article that I was wondering about, which I've put the link in the chat. It's called I Understand You Feel That Way, but I Feel This Way, The Benefits of I Language and Communicating Perspective During Conflict. So I recommend that to folks. Right, well, I think now is a good time to wrap up. A huge thanks to you, Judith. That's been two really beautifully connected and really engaging sessions, and I'm sure that everyone would echo those thoughts. It's not possible to down. Is that the last link that I sent out? That might be a geographical thing. Well, I'll send you the link. Is that a different one? Oh, that's the PDF. Yeah. So, but if for some reason you can't download it, just drop me an email, folks. I'll put my email in there and I'll send it to you. If
No,
some
this
reason
one works. This one is
if you
working
can't
now.
access
Yeah.
it, there may be some different things. But yeah, so just to say again, thanks very much, Judith. It's been a really interesting morning. There's lots for me to take away from it, and I'm sure that's the case for everybody. And so, Judith, if you can send me your slides, and we'll PDF those and make the PDF version available to participants after the event, because I certainly want to have another look at your wisdom model, and I'm sure lots of people do.
Thanks to everyone. This has been great. Thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to what comes next.
Me too, thanks. And there are various thanks going to the chat, and do add your thanks to the chat if you'd like to. So we are going to have a break now. A little before we do, a little plug for ESRAD. So ESRAD is has grown from about 30 members to about 600 members in the last 7 years. We have currently about 600 members on our books, and membership is free. And if you're not currently a member, do click the link in the chat and quickly fill out the membership application form so that you can get information about future events. Yeah, we're planning to have a conference in Slovenia next June, which is exciting. It will be hybrid, so people can connect online, but equally we'd love you all to join us in Slovenia, and that's kind of currently taking shape. Yeah.
Can I just show this? Somebody asked me to show the slide with the different books, so that would be a little bit of self-advertising. So if I can just share my screen.
You go right ahead. Yeah, stick it up. But just leave it on the screen, okay? And we can all break. And if anyone wants to screenshot it, yeah, just a couple of minutes. That'd be fine.
So that's some stuff you could read if you want to. Thank you all very much.
Brilliant. Okay, so everybody, we're going to restart in an hour. So you've got an hour for lunch, or I say lunch if you're in England, breakfast, dinner, or midnight snack, or whatever it is. I'll see you in an hour.